Thank you all. Thank you very much. Okay, so it has been my extraordinary honor for the last 20 years to teach the history of architecture at the University of Virginia. When I was offered this particular position, there was really no university in the United States where I would rather teach than the University of Virginia. And I regularly say to my kids and to my students, meaning my actual children as well as the students in my classroom, that I wake up every day and I pinch myself and I say, wow, I actually get to go to the University of Virginia and teach the history of architecture here. So it really has been my extraordinary pleasure and honor to be here. One of those reasons is, of course, because I get to teach in the midst of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The University of Virginia's Academical Village is a landscape and a set of buildings that was decided by sort of a global entity, right, the United Nations, that in fact this was a landscape that contributes not just to local or state history, doesn't contribute just to a national discourse around our own identity and our own history, but actually is a landscape that reminds us of the unfolding of democracy across the Western world in the history of the last 250 years. So the University of Virginia contributes to global history in incredibly important ways. One of the critical reasons that's true, of course, is because it was produced by, and we continuously live under the shadow of, one really extraordinary man, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, my students regularly don't often recognize that Jefferson turned his attention to constructing the University of Virginia at the age of 74. The University of Virginia is a final project. It's a capstone project from an entire life dedicated to building out the arc of democracy. What are some of the things that Jefferson is famous for? What document did he write? The Declaration of Independence, right? Absolutely. You know, so in our founding moment, that moment in which our identity as a nation is just being inaugurated, Jefferson is there, authoring that document. Jefferson, we also know, plays a role in corresponding with Madison over the construction of the Constitution. Why is that? Because Jefferson, in fact, really cares about the infrastructures of democracy. And in the midst of that conversation, he would also say, the best defense against a corrupt government is what? An educated populace. The best defense against a corrupt government is an educated populace. So that an educated populace is, in fact, actually one of the checks and balances that is built into a healthy and a sustainable democracy. And in so many ways, his commitment to building out this particular landscape is the materialization of that much larger project of a commitment, a life committed to a sustainable democracy. That's an extraordinary contribution, something that we really have to be, we are very proud of here at UVA. And when I talk about the Academical Village and this UNESCO World Heritage Site, my students often immediately default to one building within that suite of buildings that makes up the Academical Village, and that's this building, right? I say, what's the most important building at UVA? Students will regularly say, the Rotunda. And then they're a little surprised when I tell them, actually, the Rotunda is an afterthought. The infrastructure of the University of Virginia, as it was conceived by Thomas Jefferson, has everything to do with the pavilions, and that the Rotunda is actually suggested by an outsider, right? And becomes a sort of architectural resolution to the designs. When he's thinking about curriculum, there's no Rotunda. It's entirely around the pavilions. Why? Because Jefferson understood that, or had argued, that all useful knowledge falls out in 10 domains. In different sections, he says 8 domains. He sort of hasn't figured out how he's going to subdivide it, but there's 8 to 10 domains of useful knowledge. So any of you that have had any training in religious studies, Definitely not useful knowledge, right? Carve that out. Jefferson's not interested in religion or theology, which is one of the reasons why all of his faculty members have to come from Europe and have to be at the cutting edge of Enlightenment thought, right? That's a different part of the story that we'll get to. So Jefferson imagines that this new curriculum dedicated to a flourishing democracy, graduating students to become citizen leaders, they're going to have to be embedded in one of these 10 different domains of useful knowledge. That useful knowledge is going to live in the mind of a professor. That professor's mind is going to live in a body, and that professor's body is going to live where? In one of the pavilions, right? So there's actually a direct map between Jefferson's construction of useful knowledge into the commitment of 10 pavilions, 5 on either side of the academical village. How did the pavilions function? Well, we know that the upper story, of course, the upper story of these pavilions was the professor's apartment, and the lower story was the classroom. So that as the students who are living in the lawn, they're moving horizontally between their lawn rooms and across the lawn and into those classrooms, the professors would descend from above, and then the classroom space on the ground floor of the professor's pavilion is the nexus, the sort of social joining of those two different landscapes. So this is a way, and an important way, for us to understand how it is that we interpret the architecture of this UNESCO World Heritage Site, Thomas Jefferson's Academical Village. It is an extraordinary narrative, a narrative that I think really does contribute to the history of the world. But that narrative is so compelling and so overwhelming in its contributions that it means that it has overshadowed other realities that were part of the academical village. Alternative stories, different ways of understanding how this place actually functioned, that really get subsumed underneath this incredible narrative of the building up of the University of Virginia and the history of modern democracy. And so when we see the University of Virginia, we see Jefferson, we see the UNESCO World Heritage Site, we see the academical village. It's hard not to, because the story is so compelling. And so one of the things that we've had to do over the last 10 years, 5 years, and especially 2 years, is to learn how to unsee, or to see anew. How is it that we train ourselves to see the academical village differently, to expand our scope? Well, one of the ways that we do that is to actually look at new things. And so this is also the academical village at the University of Virginia, but rendered differently. This is a plat produced of UVA in 1850. And so I just want to orient you here. So this is the central lawn. Right, there's the rotunda, the building we're in. And here are the 5 pavilions on either side of the lawn. Everybody oriented? Sort of see where we are? So this plat in 1850 gives us offers us a different set of questions about how might we interpret the academical village on an alternative narrative. And so when I first spent some time really looking at this document, which was in our special collections here at UVA, I was sort of scanning through it, and I was really struck by this text up here at the top. It's a little hard to see, but maybe some of you in the front can help me read this. See this swoop? Can you see what those words say? Anybody up front? The 10 professors grass. Okay, so this is the trick. In the 19th century, a double S is rendered as an FS. So grass lots containing each 4.5 acres. The 10 professors' grass lots, each containing 4.5 acres. And that's essentially where the physics buildings and the old dorms, all spanning out to old dorms. That's where we are there. Okay, and then here, the 10 professors' gardens, 1 acre each. And so when we're looking at this plat in 1850, the university's been operating for 2.5 decades, sort of have to ask a question. Why would a professor need a 4.5 acre grass lot? Somebody said it. Yes, it's a pasturage, right? Livestock. Why would a professor need a 1 acre garden? For food, right? And so now here's the reminder that one incredibly compelling framework for us to understand and interpret the academical village at the University of Virginia is through its educational framework. and its commitment to sustainable democracy. Absolutely. But another one is, oh, wait a second, these are actually human beings who eat 3 meals a day, and there's a whole series of processes that have to happen as a way of sustaining that operation and ultimately that education. That's a question, that's a landscape, and that's a suite of people we haven't really asked a whole lot about, right? And so this is this next generation, the next chapter of the university's history that is really starting to unfold, and we're learning so much about how this particular suite of landscapes functioned. And so this means that we've been asking questions about slavery. How did the university function in its first half century under the regime of slavery? And we're coming to recognize that the University of Virginia was a plantation in many ways. In some ways, it's not a plantation. We're not doing monoculture, like, but in many ways, it's functioning like an enslaved landscape, a landscape of plantation. That's not a story we've ever really told before. And so, as we have, over the last, as I said, 5 to 8 years, been diving into this content, we're coming to recognize that when we talk about slavery, and especially talk about slavery at UVA, we actually have to talk about it in 2 different chapters. There's 2 different moments. The first is the moment of construction, and the second is the moment of operation, right? And so often folks will say, oh, you're the guy that's talking about slavery at UVA, so slaves built the University of Virginia. Absolutely, absolutely. Enslaved people are involved in the construction of the University of Virginia. But that's a majority male population, that's a 10-year period, and that's an incredibly important story. But when we delimit the narration of slavery at the University of Virginia only to its construction, right? We're talking about one group of people, and we're actually ignoring the majority. And so I'm going to unpack for us in the next little bit both of those chapters to help us understand what is it that we've been learning over these last years about how slavery functioned at UVA. So a number of years ago, this particular bit of graffiti came to light in the attic of Pavilion 1. The attic of Pavilion 1. And so this is actually written on the partition wall of the staircase that goes up into the attic. Can anybody read it? It's in 19th century script. This is definitely a 19th century hand. And that's not a C, but an H. It's hard to, so, hurrah. Hurrah for Moses. Somebody got it. Hurrah for Moses. Right? That's pretty exciting. And so we have been working with teams of undergraduates over the last 8 years to dive into the Special Collections archives, transcribe all of the university's early records into a cross-sectional database. It's called the Jewel Project, Jefferson's University, the Early Life, right? This project aggregates huge amounts of data from faculty records, Board of Visitors minutes, be careful what you say, but also letters home from students complaining about rancid butter, and diaries of professors' wives who cannot believe they found themselves in Albemarle County, right? I mean, so a rich repository of stuff. We've been transcribing all of that and dropping it into that database. That was already up and operational when we came across this bit of graffiti. So what do you think that we did? We immediately pulled up that database and said, who's Moses? Right? Because there's no document at UVA where you can go and learn about slavery. This is one of the realities that historians of slavery have been grappling with for some time. Slavery is everywhere and simultaneously nowhere. Right? It's written in, it's under the water in absolutely every document, but it's never aggregated into a single place. And so this massive cross-sectional database allows us to search for Moses in all of the university's early records, and now records also from Richmond, and we're moving up to Boston soon, different collections. If it has to do with the University of Virginia, we're trying to capture it, right? And 2 Moseses pop up. That was really exciting, right? 2 Moseses pop up. The first Moses is a master carpenter. A master carpenter who is himself an enslaved man, who's actually involved, probably overseeing another team, might actually have been the man to build this staircase, right? We know that there's a staircase added to the attic in 1832. Originally, it was just a ladder. So a staircase is added. Moses is an enslaved master carpenter who's involved in that. This might actually be the work of Moses, right? If that's right, how does this graffiti work? Who's writing it? Is Moses writing this? Yeah, probably not, right? Because then it would say, hurrah for me, right? So somebody else is writing this, celebrating Moses' work. Well, what does that tell us about communication within the enslaved population? They're literate against state law, right? Against state law, they're actually literate. So that's a really interesting and compelling story, celebrating the work of an enslaved man and telling us a little bit about, just a little glimpse into communications within the enslaved population. But I told you there were two Moseses, right? We had two hits in that search. The second Moses only shows up in one record, in the newspaper. When do the names of enslaved people show up in newspapers? When they're trying to escape. So not wills in the records, but in the newspaper as a runaway ad. Moses shows up because he's just been involved in self-emancipation, right? Reminding us that this bit of graffiti might tell us the story of honoring the work of an enslaved man who's contributing to the production of this landscape and is working hard and overseeing other enslaved people. Or it might simultaneously remind us that the landscape of slavery is a brutal regime of oppression that people wish to escape from. Both of those stories can be true, and at some point, both of those stories are true. Right? We'll never know which Moses this is, but it's really important for me to unpack both of those to remind us that the position of any one enslaved person here in the context of the labor regime of enslavement might be highly variable, right? Slavery is itself an incredibly complicated story. We also have surfaced in this research the story of Zechariah. Zechariah, we know, was dedicated to excavating the cellar of Hotel A, which you can see here. He's digging for weeks on end with a shovel by himself to create that cellar, but then his work slows because he hits bedrock. And because he's falling behind on the time, his timetable is set, he's falling behind on his time, he's not excavating as quickly because he's hit bedrock. Large numbers of other men who are at that point leveling out the terraces are redirected to support Zechariah in his excavation work, right? We know almost nothing else about Zechariah. All we know is that Zechariah was criticized for not getting the work done on time, and that other men, he's working in partnership then, at some point, with other men for the completion of this project on time. Sam the carpenter is one of the very few enslaved artisans who's actually here from the very beginning in 1817 all the way through the opening of the rotunda and the opening of the university. He's an incredibly well-respected man. He actually builds the roof framing system for the very first pavilion that's constructed, which is what's now the Colonnade Club, Pavilion 7. He is in that role overseeing the work of other enslaved men. And we know that he's actually quite successful at that because he oversees the construction of 4 other major roof framing systems elsewhere at the Academical Village, right? So he's a success story. But his story is really interesting because about halfway through the records, we see a second Sam show up. Young Sam is a carpenter's apprentice, always assigned to work with Sam the carpenter. Who's young Sam? His son. Reminding us, of course, that the story of enslavement here also implicates human relationships. What does it mean for Sam the carpenter to literally oversee? He is the overseer while he's also enslaved. What does it mean to oversee the work of your own son, training him up into an operational context in which you know that he's also going to be oppressed, and the violence of slavery is going to be enacted on him as well? We have no access to what that's like, but it's a sobering reminder of the complexity and the social complexity and the interpersonal relationships that are implicated by the story of slavery. So that context of construction, the majority of which is the story of men, dominates that first 10 years. The university then opens, professors arrive, most of them from Europe, and they occupy these pavilions. And so when we told the story, and have told the story of the early history of the university, we've tended to hone in on the biographies of these professors. This is Pavilion 4. It's now lived in by someone named Larry. What's his last name? Yeah, that guy. Like politics, maybe. I don't know. Pavilion 4 is the initial residence of George Bladerman. George Bladerman is our modern languages professor, UVA's very first modern languages professor. He comes from Berlin. And he moves into this building, and we know, of course, that he's probably living in the apartment upstairs, and he's teaching his classes and his tutorials in that ground floor space. One of the projects that historians love to do is to take the architectural record of the building together with the documentary record. And one of the great resources we have available to us is the Federal Decennial Census. Some of you have heard a little kerfuffle around a question on that 2020 census. That's the Federal Decennial Census. This is the 1830 Federal Decennial Census. And we have these for Albemarle County for 1830, 1840, 1850, and 1860. It's a really impressive body of data that allows us to get a sense of the demographics of the people that are here at the University of Virginia. So we pulled up the 1830 Decennial Census for Albemarle County. And what do we have? We drop down. Oh, there he is. Super convenient. George Bladerman, right? George Bladerman is represented in Albemarle County's census. The first section here are males. Females are over here. We look at the 40 to 40, is it 40 to 50 or 40? Yeah, 40 to 50 age range. There's George Bladerman, right? So our professor, he's about 45 years old, recent arrival from Berlin. We drop down here. Who's this, do you think? Yeah, 3 robust sons, right? 2 of them between 5 and 10, and 1 between 10 and 15. And we drop over to the other side, and who's this? Right, George Bladerman's wife. Super convenient story, husband, wife, 3 lusty boys, 2 dogs and a television set. Nice story for the population, the family that lives in Pavilion 4. That's great. Except that the building tells us a slightly different story. When you walk down the lawn and you pass in front of George Bladerman's original pavilion, what are these? They're little windows, right? Why would you want a window down into an airspace, a crawl space, right? That's our supposition. Right? Well, they're not. You flip over that Federal Decennial Census, and it continues on the second page. Now you have to do some math with me. 5 plus 3 is what? Plus 3. 11 plus 4? Plus 3. 18 plus the 5 from the previous side gets us to 23. Pavilion 4 is not the residence of 5 people. Pavilion 4 is the residence of 23 people. There's an enslaved population here of 18 affiliated with that household whose story we've never told, whose footprint doesn't show up in the landscape of the academical village. Who are these people, and where are these people, right? The Federal Decennial Census tells us a very different story. So I've told you a lie. I told you that the pavilions were 2 stories, and you believe me. You believe me because Jefferson wanted you to believe me. Jefferson represents for us in this view of the academical village a sequence of buildings that are each 2 stories in perception, right, along the lawn, 5 on each side, associated with the story of education and a sustainable democracy. But when we take different ways of seeing, we cut the academical village differently. We've created this digital model, which I'll show you more images of. And that digital model on the left is a cross-section of Pavilion 7. And what do you see? What lie did I tell you? These pavilions are all 3 stories. How is that the case? When Jefferson designs the academical village, he doesn't build 2-story buildings. He builds 3-story buildings on either side of a ridgeline. He doesn't shave off. Teams of enslaved men shave off the top of that ridgeline. That earth and rocks are moved to the side to create the flat terraces that we now enjoy, hiding that lowest floor, because the lowest floors of the pavilions are the retaining walls for the flat soil of the terraces. So you have to go down those little staircases to see that every single one of these pavilions is in fact not a 2-story building, but a 3-story building, right? Those 3-story buildings tell us a very different story. So we've been able to document and then now map, and this work was done by Ben Ford at Ryvan Archaeology. We've been able to map the demographics from the 1830, 40, 50, and 60 census. You'll see up here, there's George Bladerman, family of 5, enslaved population of 18. As one little bit of the larger distribution of the enslaved population that's permanently in residence here at the University of Virginia in 1830. And as we look at that over the arc of those 50 years, it seems that we have about 150 people enslaved at any one point in time permanently in residence at the University of Virginia. But then there's large numbers of people who don't show up in that because they're here temporarily. They're moving in and around a fluid landscape, doing all kinds of different services, right? So while we have a student population that will grow up to about 500 or so by the end of the antebellum period, we have a consistent population of about 150 enslaved people. That's a landscape of experience whose story we've not yet fully unpacked, right? We're just now at the place of coming to recognize, wow, this is an entirely different way of understanding, interpreting, and now representing Thomas Jefferson's academical village. A whole story here that had been overwhelmed by the enormity of a narration around democracy. How do we get here? How does Jefferson know to do this? Well, Jefferson's left us a little bit of an interpretive tool, right? His house, Monticello, which we'll look at in just a second, is completed prior to his project here at the University of Virginia. And so he's got a few little strategies that he works out at Monticello that he then imports and fully realizes here at UVA. How does that work? Well, this, of course, is Thomas Jefferson's spectacular dining room, right? It's really, I take my students here all the time, it is a remarkable room, but we are overwhelmed by the grandeur of the room, the power of the architecture, the moldings, the display of the decorative arts in the room when we represent this room, when we see this room as a photograph. So once again, we have to re-see the room. We have to learn how to see the room differently. This is a floor plan, right? A plan of the room, of that very same room. There are a couple features in here that, how many of you have been to Monticello? Have you toured? Yeah, okay, you've toured Monticello. So you've seen these, but maybe not through the lens that I'm about to unpack for you. So this is this room. The dining room at Monticello has this little walkway in the back of the dining room, and at the end of that walkway, there's this door that you can see in the top left. Now, the early 19th century door is usually on hinges, as doors are today, right? So they pivot in one direction. This door's not that way. This door has center pintles, so it actually spins like a lazy Susan. And so in that capacity of spinning, there's one side of the door's flat, and the other side of the door has these shelves, and you can see those shelves there. Why? Why would you need shelves on the back of a door in a hidden alleyway? Yeah. So how does this actually function? Hot food, red arrow, solid red arrow, hot food comes up from the cellar, down a hallway unseen, is put on those shelves. That person can knock on the door and leave. And then someone from within the room, dotted red line, can go, turn the door, and bring the food to the table. Curious. Not many other early 19th century planters do that. That's an unusual strategy. Now, second bit. Most of you have seen these amazing little inventions, right? Jefferson refers to these as his wine bottle elevator. So an empty bottle of wine can be put on a shelf, boop, right? That shelf, down into the cellar. The wine cellar is immediately under the dining room. Someone in that space can swap out the empty for the full bottle of wine, comes back up into the room. And ingeniously, Jefferson can go and just retrieve a fresh bottle of wine. What do both of those things do? They render invisible the labor of the enslaved African Americans, right? He's very attentive to rendering invisible the impact and the labor of slavery. Last bit, this thing, right? This thing is on casters, and Jefferson designs these to actually move around the dining room table. What would it do? Serving. For serving, actually for unserving, for clearing out the table after a course. The whole thing can just move around the back of the table, and you can take your own dirty plate and put it on what he calls a dumb waiter. In the 19th century sense, unpack that word for me for just a second. What does dumb waiter mean? Silent service. Rendered invisible, rendered mute. And so it's astonishing for us in our 20th century mode for us to think back to the early 19th century performance of dining. If you're an elite white person sitting at a table, ladies and gentlemen, you are not clearing your own plate. That does not happen. But at Jefferson's table, you are asked to do that. Diners with Jefferson are astonished at the various strategy he uses to exclude service, right? He's quite intentional about that. And so he's thinking through strategies for minimizing access at the dining room table, but also on his property. We've just finished a nice meal. We go out through that side door into the rear lawn, right? We go out onto that flat, terraced lawn, and we're enjoying a little port. What do we not see? Once again, there's a whole row of those buildings, quartering spaces, dairy chambers, stables, smokehouses, kitchens. Those buildings, those rooms are all holding up. They're the retaining wall for that flat terrace. When you're on that flat terrace, you can't see those spaces. He's quite attentive to the visual experiences of access to the landscape of slavery. He's a genius designer. Having already resolved all of that, practiced at Monticello, he then turns his attention to the University of Virginia and deploys exactly the same strategies, right? Okay, so one of Jefferson's drawings for these three-story buildings. One of the things that we've come to realize is that we have enough of the historical record to begin to understand and interpret that third floor. There is a whole landscape of the African-American experience that Jefferson wanted us not to see, that we have to work pretty hard now to actually see. We have estimated that there are thousands of enslaved people in that 50-year period who are working at some point in time in this landscape. Very few of them owned by the institution. The institution, the University of Virginia as an institution, owns very, very few enslaved people. The majority are owned by hotel keepers and by faculty members. We only have 2 photographs. Of those thousands of people, we have 2 photographs. This is one of those. Lucy Cottrell shows up as a, she's in this photograph largely because why? She's holding Charlotte Bladerman, one of those 3 lusty sons, grows up, has a wife. This is the first granddaughter. George Bladerman's first granddaughter, Charlotte, is being represented here, being held by Lucy Cottrell. Lucy Cottrell was purchased from Monticello at Thomas Jefferson's, after Thomas Jefferson's death and the liquidation of the estate. The Cottrell family, she moves with her ailing mother, and her 2 young boys are purchased by George Bladerman, who's a new arrival from Berlin without an enslaved population. He purchases from Jefferson's estate. She moves from Monticello here to the University of Virginia, and we have a remarkable survival of her story. Of those 18 people that show up in the 1830 census, Lucy Cottrell is one of those 18 people, right? So there's the story of her narration, which is a really remarkable survival. There's also, however, another sobering moment. And that is, George Bladerman was dismissed from the University of Virginia. He was dismissed for publicly beating his wife twice. If he publicly beat his wife, we can only imagine the abuse that he extended to Lucy Cottrell. Another sobering reminder, right, that this place has a very different perspective from the descendants of that particular population. It's also a reminder for us that these spectacular gardens that we all love and enjoy that stand behind the pavilions did not operate that way, right? Those gardens of tulips and azaleas, blooming dogwoods, were all installed between 1948 and 1952 by the ladies of the Garden Club of Virginia. Those were all installed in the mid-century because by the 1940s, the infrastructure that's essential to create a meal has all moved indoors because of what invention? The refrigerator, right? The invention of the refrigerator and the rise of the grocery store means that that operational landscape of food production is no longer necessary. It's fallen into demise over the last couple decades. So those garden spaces are abandoned, walls are falling down, trees are growing up. Actually, a road is driven through, right, a whole series of one of the gardens. The ladies of the Garden Club of Virginia come in and they restore those spaces to what they imagine Jefferson's gardens would have been, right? They're actually archaeologists. They're doing research. They get it wrong, but they really are trying quite well, right, to reimagine what Jefferson's gardens are like. But these spaces were, in fact, not that way at all. When we look at this 1850 print, you can see that there's a whole series of little tiny buildings, structures scattered in all of those yards, right? Those yards are littered with buildings that are going to be smokehouses. This is one of the few that survives in its footprint, is largely intact, right? This is McGuffey's cottage behind Pavilion 9. It's one of the few that actually survives largely unaltered. But there were lots of these. Kitchen buildings, additional quartering spaces for the enslaved population, smokehouses, dairies, all those things that you associate with the 19th century plantation, they're all here, tenfold in the backs of the various pavilion gardens. By that point, they've all been lost. So one of the projects, the ladies of the Garden Club of Virginia are not particularly eager for us to go in and just clear out every single one of those gardens, right? Those gardens are now an important part of the historic landscape. They're more than 50 years old themselves. And so one strategy that we've used to better understand how this place actually operates in this period is a digital model. And so for the last 5 years, partnership with the library and some of our School of Architecture specialists, or whiz-bang designers in the School of Architecture, have been producing this digital model. This is where I get to geek out for just a second. This digital model is accurate to the inch. Look at the scale. That's crazy, right? This is a crazy accurate model. But it also means that we can strip out everything that's after the Civil War. Most of the additions most of the pavilions are doubled in footprint with an addition to the back. We've ripped all of those off. We've ripped out all of those gardens. And we've used all the best archaeological data to start to reconstruct what those spaces would look like. We've also corrected the terrain. We know that the topography has shifted over time. We have archaeological evidence for the shifting in that particular, in the elevations of those. And so this is, we know the most about Pavilion 6, the garden behind Pavilion 6, because we've had the most archaeology in that particular pavilion. And so here you have a corner privy, stacks of firewood. We have evidence for washing. There's a post hole line here for a fence. And so where the faculty members today park their cars was actually an additional work yard adjacent to that space. And so this is panning back just a little bit. And this is a work in progress. We're just continuously adding things as we have either documentary records, very early photographs, archaeological evidence, or written accounts. We're constantly scanning for data about how these backyards functioned, and eventually we'd like to get this to a timestamp as well. What does it look like in 1830, and how's that different from 1850, right? And so this is a large project that will be unfolding over the next number of years. And so here's a well that's in one of these work yards, and this is the kitchen behind Pavilion 6. And this is a particularly important kitchen because we know that the cook in this kitchen was Isabella Gibbons, the person for whom we have the second photograph. And so here you see Isabella Gibbons. Her story is particularly important. We'll get to that in just a few minutes at the end of our talk today. There's one other building that's worthy of attention that does not survive in the landscape today, and that's the Anatomical Theater. Jefferson fully recognized that we needed to have a training in medicine, and that a foundation for training in medicine was anatomy, right? One has to study anatomy. It's kind of like basic math before you move to advanced math. So anatomy was essential. The anatomical professor, or the professor of anatomy, I should say, was not particularly eager to have cadaver dissections on his dining room table. And so it was really clear pretty quickly that we're going to need a dedicated space, a building just reserved for anatomical dissections. And so this is Jefferson's drawing for that anatomical theater. It's the very last building he designs, and he doesn't actually see it to completion. His death happens while the building is under construction. But here you see the anatomical theater. It stood approximately where the Berlin Wall installation now stands adjacent to Alderman Library. You can see that we've added there on the top left of the digital design. Here's a close-up. And I'm showing you this close-up in its exterior and its interior because my son actually did the work on this particular digital model, and it's one of my favorite components of the entire digital design. So just loving on my son here for just a second. Raising for us a question. Where are we getting cadavers? A long-standing assumption was that we were getting cadavers, of course, from felons, right? It was a standard narration that felons, executed felons, executed by the state, gave their body over for medical study. But about 6 years ago, we uncovered a cache of letters by a professor, Professor Davis. Professor Davis is actually involved, he's the second anatomy professor, he's involved in setting up a process whereby we're importing cadavers from Richmond. Importing cadavers from Richmond, where we're hiring a community of people called resurrectionists. Those resurrectionists live at the edges of the enslaved and the free black society community in Richmond. And when they hear of a recent internment, their job is to go within about 48 hours and exhume the body, put the body in a barrel, put that barrel on the train, and that train comes to Charlottesville. And an enslaved man at the University of Virginia named Anatomical Lewis, it's his job to go retrieve the barrels and prepare the cadavers for dissection. And so, yes, this is a very hard part of the story. We're not even sure how fully to tell this bit of the story yet. It's so stunning. But this is a process that's happening fairly regularly. So I'm just going to give you this is just a snapshot here of a letter between Professor Davis, whose image you see on the screen, and some of his correspondents in Richmond about the process of providing enough cadavers. And one of the reasons that this is a challenge is because the University of Virginia has a commitment to ensuring that the students themselves are not just watching a cadaver dissection, but they're actually involved in cadaver dissections, which means that our consumption of cadavers is a much higher rate than is standard for medical practice in this period. This also raises for us a different question about how slavery is implicated at the University of Virginia, not just in its operation, but also in the ways that slavery shapes our education and our research. Thomas Jefferson, when he is in Paris in the 1780s, is actually involved in a conversation with Buffon and a number of other Enlightenment thinkers around the origins of the races, right? And so this is an emerging scientific debate, theoretical scientific debate, about how is it that we have different races? How do we explain the emergence of race as a subject? And Jefferson has the capacity to talk about the differential emergence of races because he is involved, he believes in polygenesis, right? Buffon, his principal correspondent, is a Catholic. He's committed to monogenesis. What is monogenesis? One origin. Their names are Adam and Eve, right? Yeah, so this is a religious commitment to the emergence of all humanity from two people, Adam and Eve. Monogenesis means that we have to come up with an explanation for the emergence of races from a singular father and mother, right? And so this is an open debate, and this is a really robust conversation that's happening in 18th century Paris. Jefferson is actually involved in that. He brings those questions back to the University of Virginia, and our medical practices in the 19th century relative to our medical theory are hovering often on this particular question, is how do races emerge? James Lawrence Cabell, whose image you see here, taught medical theory at the University of Virginia for 52 years. And in that particular period, he actually publishes in 1859 The Testimony of Modern Science in the Unity of Mankind. By arguing for the unity of mankind, Cabell makes very clear he's a monogenicist, right? That's what unity of mankind means there. But he still has to grapple with how do we come up with races. And so his explanation here, the scientific explanation that he would purport, is that there's the emergence of permanent varieties. And he's getting this language from horticulture. So when one takes a species of plant and puts it in different soil, you can actually generate different colors of flower. And so this notion that the context of maturity generates difference is something that he's importing into his understanding for the origins of races. Difficult for us and troubling for us is this notion of essentialism, that permanence, that racial difference is not just observable in physical distinction, but it is now a permanent condition that implicates intellectual capacity and moral character. And so through the 19th century, our study of race, based on structures that are exhibited through slavery, purport to provide medical scientific basis for a hierarchy of the races, which undergirds so much of the 20th century expression of racial bias. suppositions of differential capacities in intellect or in moral character, they find their origins in research happening at places like the University of Virginia and Harvard University. And so slavery implicates not just our operations, but also our medical theory and our suppositions around the origins of races. A number of years ago, we started the project of the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, catalyzed largely by activity from a number of our students. Students raised concerns about the fact that the university was not telling a particular story about slavery. And so in that response, the University of Virginia, led largely by President Sullivan, established the President's Commission on Slavery. And that's been followed up now by the President's Commission on Segregation. The principal recommendation from the President's Commission on Slavery was to inaugurate a new memorial. And that's what we're about to go see as we come to a close. I'm going to walk you through some of the symbolism of this particular memorial. It's important for us to recognize, however, that this process was not one that was suggested by the university. We hired a designer, and it was pressed down into the landscape. Really important, President Sullivan understood this from the very beginning, is what's going to be essential that we bring to the table the descendant community. If this is a memorial about slavery that actually acknowledges and tells some hard truth, then the descendant population needs to be there and contribute to that conversation. So before any design work happened, Frank Dukes and other members of the design team were engaged in community conversations in parish houses throughout, parish halls throughout Charlottesville, in people's basements and in kitchens, collective community conversations where we asked the descendant community to tell the design team, what is it that you want this memorial to look like? What particular symbols do you want that are important in this memorial? And so we came back with a whole series of commitments and values from the community before the design process began. So Howler and Yoon, who are the design architects for this memorial, have done an absolutely spectacular job of taking those particular commitments and integrating them into the design itself. It had to be a place of gathering. It was, the community made very clear that collective gathering and some unity together in community was one of the only ways that they've been able to sustain themselves under the persistent oppression of racism after slavery. Libation and liberation. It was important to have a water feature, that water feature was a symbol of renewal, of new life. So it was really critical that it have some kind of a water feature. It needed to honor the enslaved. And here we heard time and time again, or the design team heard time and time again, name the names. Name the names. The memorial must have the names. And so after some calculation, we've determined that there were about 4,000 people enslaved at the University of Virginia. 4,000 enslaved people who labored at the University of Virginia at some point in time. We have about 500 names at this point. Those 500 names are inscribed over 4,000 gashes, reminding us that 3,500 of those gashes have no name above, visually communicating the erasure of their dignity and their identity just as a result of both slavery and of its persistent racism. And then remembering the enslaved. I'm going to save that. There's a really wonderful little strategy that they came up with for that. So this is an aerial view of what the mature site will look like. It's also going to be in the midst of a stand of trees, and I think those trees are actually going to start going in. I saw an email just in the next week or so. So that's really exciting. The memorial here you can see is substantial in size. This is really important. The diameter of the memorial is the same diameter as this building, as the rotunda. A monumental commitment to signaling in the landscape through a permanent alteration that we're not going to forget this particular story, right? So it's very large. It has places it's large enough also for conversation and collaboration, but also quiet contemplation. You can see the water feature there just behind the bench, and then the wall with the names, which I have to say the very first time I saw was, it's a very, very moving installation. Its location is immediately adjacent to Brooks Hall, in a place that I did not know was called the TOG, the Triangle of Grass, which is the open space between the corner. The students all knew this. I said the TOG, and they're like, oh yeah, okay. I'm like, I've never heard of the TOG. I don't know what that is. But so it's in the TOG. But importantly, you can see on the outside here, can you see what's that right there? It's a shadow. That shadow represents It's a little hard to see. Oh, a face. It's a face. Very good. Those are eyes. A right eye and a left eye. They're, in fact, Isabella Gibbons's eyes. And so changing light conditions means that her eyes will become immediately visible and then invisible. There's a sort of life to her presence in this landscape. She's also enormous. She's gone from relegated to the margins. She's now enormous. She's embedded in the soil, right? Her story is now one of monument. Her story is particularly important because at the moment of emancipation, she chose not to flee Charlottesville, but she went from her role as a cook behind Pavilion 6 to being one of the lead educators in Charlottesville's newly established black school, the African American school, the Jefferson School downtown. And she functioned for the rest of her life as one of the lead educators in that particular place. Why was she fully qualified to be one of the most important educators in black Charlottesville? She was literate and had been educated at the University of Virginia, right? She had spent most of her life hearing lectures, overhearing the unfolding of a world-class education. She deployed that literacy and that world-class education to training up the rest of the newly emancipated black Charlottesville. It's an incredible story. She is one of UVA's heroes. We have a remarkable survival, and we'll close with this, a remarkable survival of a lesson, a lecture lesson that she gave in 1867. And a quote out of that reads this: "Can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten that by those horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, nor ever will." It's an incredibly powerful narration. But it also reminds us that UVA had forgotten. She hadn't forgotten. The black community hadn't forgotten. But as an institution, we had. And I'm so proud of the University of Virginia for doing this work of turning a clear eye and a clear light on the truth-telling of this story, to fold it into and integrate it with the rightful place we have as a leader in democracy. That these two stories are part and parcel of the same thing. If, in fact, as the University of Virginia, we're going to be a leader towards a sustainable democracy, we have also to be committed to telling the truth. Right? We have to be committed to telling the truth. And I'll have students occasionally ask me, "Do you hate UVA?" And I'll turn and remind them, I've been here for 20 years. I do this hard work, and so many other people are doing this hard work, not because we hate the University of Virginia, but in fact because we love the University of Virginia. I want, and we all want, the University of Virginia to be the very best University of Virginia that it can be. But to do that, it has to have the courage to tell the truth. And that's where we are. And that's one of the things that gets me up every day to continue to come to teach here. I'm so proud of our university for doing this good work. Now let's go see the memorial.